What about whey protein? Have you done any research on that? What's in that?
Yeah, whey protein doesn't in any way bother me in any way. It's just more quality. I look through, so much of our environment, even on social media, is macros. It's like how much protein, how much fat, whole 30, keto diets, Mediterranean. I mean, you name the diet, Atkins, whatever. There's always a fad, right? And it's always about the macros of what you're eating. I worry far less about macros as I do the quality. And when I think quality, I think about where it's sourced, how it's packaged, I think about whether or not it's USDA organic, which is the only food certification we have in this country, in the US, because we have nothing else in terms of oversight, really, in terms of the food industry. Yeah, it's a real problem here because they've been grandfathered in thousands, actually around 12,000 estimated food chemicals that are food additives that are allowable, but have never really been tested for safety or toxicity. I mean, even dating back to 1958 with the food amendment that passed, which didn't do anything. So the idea is that we have very little regulation and oversight, but USDA organic certification took 10 years to bring to the market and actually really is something we can all benefit from here in the States. I know the equivalent in the UK and Europe, has the same criteria, similar, and really does a great job. I'm not sure. Do you eat a lot of organic foods?
Not enough, no.
Yeah, and is it more pricey over in the States, or what do you find about that?
Um, I mean, when I'm at home, when I'm not at university, I'll probably eat more. My parents will go to like a farm shop, which is just like maybe even more organic than like a big chain store. But
Yeah,
organic food's definitely slightly more expensive in
yeah.
any shop. But obviously, if you can afford it, it is worth it.
Yeah, and frozen USDA organics here are really much cheaper and bring the price down. Plus, they have the added benefit of actually locking in nutrients because they're frozen, flash frozen. So I encourage local farmers to share how they, grow their food and whether they use certain chemicals. I encourage local farming support. And nutrition wise, once something is picked from the ground, it has the highest level of nutrient value. So I definitely encourage all that, but for all the folks that I'm used to seeing, we don't all have that accessible even year round. That's when USDA frozen foods are great. You just want to put them in glass and stainless steel to heat up so you don't get those added, packaging chemicals.
Yeah, I didn't even think to look in like freezers for like organic
Why
stuff.
would
That's a
you,
good idea.
right? Because we
Yeah, yeah.
grow up thinking that everything that comes to the ground immediately is fresh, is great. But in our food system, at least here, it's actually one of the downsides is that food travels long distances. The soil quality isn't always so great. And so and they keep, some of these produce, they actually put in low temperature refrigerators for weeks on end before it gets to the supermarket fresh section. So there's a lot about the food system that has changed over the last several decades. And, this is just kind of working around the problem. Frozens are great, cheaper, accessible across the country, nutrient rich, all of that.
Yeah, I'll definitely look into that. Um, in simple terms, how would you define a toxin, if you can?
Cool. So, a toxin. So let me go back a second. I got, as a person who tries to get it right and be, as a researcher, toxin by definition is the wrong word that we use in everyday terminology. So really it should be toxic, Toxic as a noun, right? A toxic is really a synthetic made compound, and a toxin is actually considered to be truly a toxin. It has to come from a living creature. So we think snake venom or something from a plant. And so technically, we're all getting it wrong by calling it a toxin, but you have to meet people where they're at. So when you're writing a book or you're talking about this material, you have to say toxin because people are like, oh yeah, toxin. Essentially, the colloquial terminology is really that it's just bad for the body and it can harm the body. So it's an overarching term that says basically it's like poison, right? And, I would venture to say that not all chemicals are poisonous in the sense that you're going to, be exposed and drop dead. It's more about how do these chemicals and which ones and where do they come from? How do they work insidiously to affect, human beings and pets at the cellular level? And how do they really create an inflammatory response in the way that I talk about it that can trigger actual clinical disease? So you can kind of be walking around feeling good, no big deal, but over time you might build up, where your threshold is reached and you end up having or developing some type of inflammatory condition. So that's kind of what I'm trying to teach about toxins, toxics, is that we have a lot of them. We just need to know how and where they come from. And then we need to be empowered to reduce those exposures, which I clearly try to do with the work I do.
Yeah. What are some common examples of autoimmune diseases that can
So
be?
there in the medical literature, there's upwards of about 80 of them. I mean, that's sort of the going number for how many are classically derived, written in Western, textbooks and medical literature. I will tell you that there's a lot more, you know, syndromes that fall within those that have features of different autoimmune diseases, but don't get called classically an autoimmune disease, which actually works against a lot of patients in many ways because they look great on paper, but they don't feel good, or they have things that are not believable by many healthcare practitioners. But autoimmune diseases actually have been on the rise, not just in the US, but around the world, because we're a global world now. And the going estimate is in the US, 7 to 14% of US citizens, which is about 24 to 50 million people, 330, have one or more type of autoimmune disease. And that could be any range from really bad stuff to really, no big deal, but simply diagnosed. And what we're seeing now around the world is the same thing, that there's been an increase, not just in autoimmune diseases being diagnosed, but also at younger ages with no family history. And that's concerning because that reminds me of my dog, right? He's getting sick at an age that's really young. He shouldn't even be having this illness. And so why is that happening, And really, a lot of it may have to do with his environment and our environments shifting a lot of conditions that we might not have had as much exposure, but now we're having more and more exposures to a lot of different chemicals, and mixtures of them in the body also have been linked to higher rates and faster onset. So the goal is really to say, again, let's push back on these exposures. Let's not necessarily wait for regulation. If you take one dye, red dye number 3 made a lot of news recently that they're, trying to ban. First of all, they're not going to put that into effect for a couple of years, right? They're going to give manufacturers, of course, right? They get the biggest, benefit. They get 2 or 3 years to just implement that into their products. And that's one of 10,000 food additives that potentially should be looked at for harm and toxicity. So in our lifetime, your lifetime, we're not going to have the ability to wait that out to protect us. We have to do it for ourselves.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree. We've mentioned mercury and BPA. What are some other really common toxics that we're exposed to on a daily basis?
So, they come in different packages. So, for instance, as a young person, my kids too, they love cologne, they love, personal care products. They don't love cleaning products. I can assure you on that one. Your rooms are gross. But I will tell you that many of the cleaning and cosmetic products really actually share a lot of chemicals, and one of them is fragrance. Fragrances or perfume, if you look at a label on shampoo, conditioner, even cleaning products, that is actually a proprietary combination of chemicals and can be upwards of, 300 or 1,000. It doesn't matter. We're never going to know because it's considered sort of like the secret formula, like, Coca-Cola or whatever. And so because legislation is weighted towards manufacturing, they don't have to reveal those ingredients to consumers. And those chemicals that are in fragrance, often called phthalates, spelled with a PHTHALATES, there are thousands of them in the industrial market. They do a lot of interesting things. They make plastics bendable, as one example, where BPA tends to make it harder. They also extend the scent for fragrance in many products. So, among a lot of their functions, they are used to really keep that shelf life going for a long time, and also on our bodies, so that we like our colognes and perfume because we smell all day long. But they have been linked to hormone disruption, as well as immune system disruption. And, very low levels, but when you're using them every day in lots of different products, you're never really washing them out, even if they have a short half life, like BPA is relatively short. So it's called pseudo persistence. You're constantly being bombarded by different areas that they're coming in. And so you really want to just work your way through what you're being exposed to and from which direction. Again, I do that with this book with 21 Day Plan because I'm trying to get people to say, oh, you start day one this, day two this, day three, trying to get people to wrap their head around a very simple process.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, what about when you say fragrance? Do you also mean like deodorants as well?
Yeah,
Yeah,
anything that has an odor is essential. I mean, it could be your, dishwashing soap. It could be your laundry detergent. Scents are $1 billion industry. I mean, they are literally infused into everything. In fact, in the States, you could walk in front of a store and they spray outside their building, to pull you in, which, in some states, actually in the workplace, the American Disabilities Act does not allow you to wear cologne or perfume if it bothers other workers. So there's lots of things that are tied to scent that we don't always think about, but in the workplace it can be a problem. Outside of the workplace, in private owned stores, they actually spray it so they can get more customers in. So it's luring you in.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm assuming the solution isn't to not wear any kind of scents or any deodorants or not wash your dishes. So, what are some kind of solutions that we can implement in our daily lives?
So, it's interesting, when I was doing edits for, my book Detoxified, this is the US version, but you guys have a different version. Hopefully they'll send me my copy soon. Has a water spout on the front. It was interesting that they changed out the resources to look the products up, that you guys have a different database. And I can't think of the name off the top of my head, but it was sort of the equivalent of what we have here, which we have a lot of different free apps and we have a lot of websites that you can basically just go on and look up products either by what you want to use or you've been using to see if it is kind of rated higher in terms of toxicity or lower and decide what you want to do. Or you can make your own. I put some actually do it yourself recipes for all of this stuff, deodorant, personal care stuff, but also cleaning products in the book because you don't need that many ingredients like white vinegar and sea salt. And, it's not complicated. But for people who really want to swap out, which is another part of what I teach, without having to give anything up, you just want to try to find safer versions of what you're doing. And I teach high school and I throw products at them and they look them up and they talk amongst themselves and they come up with different solutions because there's so many good clean products out there. It's just a matter of knowing how to have the right vetted resources.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of a ignorance in some way, not in like a bad way. People aren't choosing to ignore the signs; they're just being fed stuff like easily accessible stuff, whether it's food, whether it's like cheap deodorant or canned tuna. Like we don't get taught. Don't try to avoid those things. Here are the better alternatives.
Oh, for sure. And listen, if doctors aren't being taught and the people that are supposed to be on the front lines of health, you can't expect everyday people to know this material. Like I wouldn't know anything about my computer system because I'm not a tech person, right? I pay an IT guy to help me get rid of viruses and all that. I think the problem is that, unfortunately, because people are getting a little sicker than they should, even at younger ages, or maybe they just want to be healthy the rest of their lives and really work at that, they just don't have great resources. And I think part of the problem is finding people that maybe are good messengers or people who write really intellectual, intelligent books or, asking, some of your websites where they're not selling products. I've never sold products other than books and curriculum because I really felt strongly that if I'm going to move into the areas of education and academics, that I probably didn't want to be watered down with that conflict of interest. And, I think there are many people out there that you and your friends and people listening will find very palatable in terms of who you want to listen to. And hopefully they'll be giving good information that's not tied to products or some kind of commercial gain.